Okay, so ready for a deep dive into something really fascinating. We're going to be exploring psychedelics today.
Mm-hmm.
And, specifically, we're going deep into Professor David Nutt's book, New W Psychedelics, the revolutionary drugs that could change your...
Right.
I think psychedelics have been in the news a lot lately, so I
Yeah.
think it's a really good time to kind of unpack some of the
That's
science behind them and really kind of get into
Yeah.
how these substances actually interact with our brains.
Yeah. And what I find really interesting about Professor Nutt's approach is that he kind of comes at it from a very different angle than we're maybe used to hearing about.
Okay.
He's a leading psychopharmacologist, and he's really advocating for this scientific, evidence-based understanding of psychedelics.
So we're kind of ditching the whole tie-dye,
Exactly.
the stereotypes.
Yeah, exactly.
And really getting down to like the nitty-gritty of how
Absolutely.
these things work.
You got it. It's, for decades, psychedelics, they've been painted as this like dangerous, unpredictable thing. And that really led to that UN ban back in the late 60s.
Right.
But what Professor Nutt really highlights is that a lot of this fear-mongering, it wasn't really based on scientific evidence as much as it was, kind of like a cultural kind of like
a knee-jerk reaction.
Yeah. A knee-jerk reaction. And that's what makes his book, I think, so crucial right now, because it's really part of this new wave of research that's challenging those old assumptions.
Okay.
And really starting to reveal the potential that these substances might hold, especially when it comes to things like mental health.
That's really interesting, and I'm really curious about this because, when we think about psychedelics, there's a lot of baggage there.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So what are like some of what are the big misconceptions that are out there?
Well, I think one of the biggest ones, and the one that Professor Nutt really tackles head on, is this idea that psychedelics, they mimic psychosis.
Okay.
But his research, what's so fascinating is it suggests that they actually do the opposite.
So instead of sending your brain into a state of psychosis,
they disrupt it.
They interrupt it.
Yeah.
Okay, how that's fascinating. So how does that even work?
So that's where this thing called the default mode network comes in.
Okay.
Professor Nutt refers to it as the DMN.
Okay.
And it's essentially like, if you think about it, it's the conductor of our brains, right? It kind of keeps our thoughts, our memories, our sense of self all organized. But the thing is that sometimes this network, it can become a bit rigid.
Okay.
And it can kind of trap us in these negative thought loops or limit our perspective.
It's like being stuck in a rut, but it's mental.
Exactly.
Okay.
And what Professor Nutt explains is that psychedelics, they have this really unique ability to kind of disrupt these rigid patterns of the DMN. It's like they shake things up in there.
Okay.
And they allow the brain to kind of explore these new pathways and connections. He even uses this analogy of mind-forged manacles to describe how the DMN can sometimes, hold us back.
So it's less about mimicking psychosis and more about breaking free from these mental constraints that we've kind of built for ourselves.
Yeah, you got and this disruption, what's so cool is that Professor Nutt's research show that it can create these really like profound shifts in our perception and understanding. And he talks about how our brains, they don't actually record reality, like a camera.
Yeah.
We construct it, based on our predictions, our past experiences. And so psychedelics, what they're doing is, because they disrupt these ingrained patterns, they kind of force the brain to reevaluate its assumptions about the world around us.
So it's almost like hitting the reset button a little bit on kind of how we perceive the world. But I guess the big question here is, how does that translate to like an actual therapeutic benefit?
Right.
Like how that's kind of, I think, what I'm really curious about.
Yeah, and that's really the $1 million question. And Professor Nutt he dives deep into this and explores how these shifts in perception can actually be channeled to address all sorts of mental health challenges.
Okay.
We're talking about things like depression, anxiety, addiction, even PTSD.
So these are serious things that oftentimes require,
absolutely,
pretty extensive and ongoing treatment.
Yeah.
So is he suggesting that psychedelics could be like a viable option in these cases?
He makes a pretty compelling case for their potential, and he backs it up with some pretty striking examples from his research. And one story that really stuck out to me is about this veteran.
Okay.
He calls him Paul, who had been struggling with really severe PTSD for years, and he'd gone through traditional therapies and hadn't really found much relief, and then he participated in these controlled ayahuasca ceremonies as part of this structured retreat program.
So not just like a casual,
Exactly.
recreational kind of experience, but something that's
more guided and therapeutic.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's really crucial, I think, to understand here.
Okay.
Professor Nutt emphasizes this throughout the book, that the setting, the intention, the integration process, all of that is critical for actually achieving these lasting therapeutic benefits.
Okay.
And so in Paul's case, these ceremonies combined with therapy, combined with support, it allowed him to kind of confront his trauma in a completely new way.
Wow.
And ultimately experience this really profound healing and personal transformation.
That's really powerful. But I imagine that there are concerns about, potential risks too, especially with something like PTSD, where, individuals might be more vulnerable.
Absolutely. And Professor Nutt, he doesn't shy away from that at all.
Okay.
He's very clear that responsible research and ethical practices are absolutely paramount.
Yeah.
This is not about advocating for casual use or self-medication.
Yeah.
This is about exploring the potential of these substances.
Okay.
But in a very safe, controlled environment with proper medical supervision.
So no dropping acid at a music festival and hoping for some kind of...
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Not quite, yeah. And he really emphasizes this importance of set and setting.
Okay.
And by set, he means like the individual's mindset.
Okay.
Going into it, their intentions, their overall mental state. And then setting is all about the environment, right? So a safe, comfortable space with trained professionals who can actually provide support and guidance throughout the experience.
So it's really about creating those optimal conditions for healing and exploration, much like you would with any other form of therapy.
Precisely. And this is where, Professor Nutt's expertise as the psychopharmacologist.
Yeah.
It really shines here because he really delves into the specific ways that different psychedelics are actually interacting with the brain.
Okay.
And how that plays into their potential for disrupting these really deeply ingrained thought patterns and behaviors that often contribute to a lot of these mental health challenges.
You mentioned addiction earlier, and I'm really interested in that specifically because it seems so counterintuitive.
I know, right?
To use,
like, how could you possibly
a substance to treat addiction? It's like it seems like you'd be feeding it in a way.
Right, but Professor Nutt argues that because psychedelics work so differently than, say, an addictive drug, like an opioid or a stimulant, they can actually be these really powerful tools in breaking these cycles of addiction.
How so? What's the science behind that?
So it goes back to what we were discussing earlier about the default mode network. And how Professor Nutt really emphasizes that addiction, it often stems from these very deeply ingrained patterns of behavior, patterns of thought, these cravings, these compulsions that just feel impossible to escape.
It's like those mental loops that people get stuck in.
Exactly.
Right.
And so because psychedelics can disrupt the DMN, they can shake up those rigid patterns and essentially create this window of opportunity for change. And he points to this really promising research into the use of psychedelics for treating nicotine addiction. For example. And there were some studies where people who received psilocybin therapy had a much higher success rate in quitting smoking.
Wow.
Compared to those using traditional methods.
So it's almost like they're rewiring those reward pathways in the brain or something?
That's a great way to put it, yeah. Yeah, and the potential applications, they extend beyond just nicotine addiction, right?
Yeah.
Professor Nutt talks about research looking at psilocybin for alcohol dependence. And early findings suggest that it could help reduce cravings, increase people's their sense of control over their drinking.
So it really is kind of like changing how we look at this and how we treat this. But with anything new like this, there's always going to be those questions about long-term effects.
Of course, yeah.
Are there any risks associated with using psychedelics in this way, even in this kind of very controlled setting. I mean, it does seem like we're kind of like venturing into uncharted territory a little bit with some of these treatments. So it's natural to wonder about those long-term implications. Does Professor Nutt address those concerns at all?
He does, and he really emphasizes that responsible research, that needs to go hand in hand with exploring the potential benefits.
Right.
He's clear that we're still really in the early stages of understanding the long-term effects of psychedelics.
Yeah.
Even when they're used in these controlled therapeutic settings.
So it's kind of a call for both cautious optimism, but also, you know, like rigorous scientific inquiry.
Absolutely, yeah. It's about approaching this whole field with a really balanced perspective, acknowledging that there is this promising potential, but also that there's a real need for ongoing research.
Right.
To ensure safety, to ensure efficacy.
Yeah.
But I think what's really, really groundbreaking about Professor Nutt's work is that it extends beyond just treating these specific conditions, right?
Okay.
He really delves into how psychedelic research challenges our very understanding of consciousness itself.
Okay, so that's a huge concept. So
it is.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit? Like what is the connection between psychedelics and consciousness?
Well, think back to what we were discussing earlier about how the brain actually constructs our reality, right?
Yeah.
And so if psychedelics can disrupt those constructions, even temporarily, it raises these really, really profound questions, I think, about the nature of perception, about identity, about what we even consider to be real, right? And so Professor Nutt argues that these substances, they offer this really unique window into the subjective experience of consciousness.
So it's not just about like alleviating suffering. It's also about kind of expanding our understanding of what it means to be human.
Exactly, precisely. Yeah, and that's where things get really, really mind-bending. Because if as Professor Nutt suggests, our everyday perception is really just one way of constructing reality.
Right.
Then what does that say about the potential of the human mind? Could there be other ways of seeing, of feeling, of experiencing the world that we haven't even begun to imagine?
Yeah, that's a pretty profound
It really is.
question to kind of end on here.
Yeah.
It definitely makes you think about things in a different way.
It does.
So for our listeners out there who are, intrigued by this and want to learn more about this, I highly recommend checking out Professor Nutt's book.
It's fascinating.
It's called New W Psychedelics: The Revolutionary Drugs That Could Change Your.
It's a really fascinating read, yeah.
But I think, the takeaway here is responsible exploration is key, right?
Absolutely.
So always seek out accurate information from credible sources and prioritize safety.
Absolutely.
But until next time, keep those minds open and keep diving deep.
That's right.